Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike O'Malley here with the Hurricane Outlook and discussion for June 22nd, 2021, recorded around 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time. We have a lot to talk about today, including the potential for one or two systems to be forming in the Eastern Pacific or Atlantic Basin over the next couple of days. Let's go ahead and jump straight into everything. Taking a weather look across the tropical Atlantic this afternoon, we noticed that really there's not too much going on right now. We have post-tropical cyclone Claudette, which is now nearing Atlantic Canada and the Canadian Maritimes, and this is going to pose no more threat to the United States. We have a cold front that is kind of all the way from Maine all the way back here, and the trailing end of it passing through Louisiana and really South Carolina, Georgia, and into North Florida. And just immediately ahead of this front, you have a lot of convection that is breaking out here across portions of the Florida Peninsula. And this will likely be the case over the next couple of days. So heavy rainfall, potential for some flooding. Not really too big of a concern there. And then we have a tropical wave in the Atlantic Basin with a 20% chance over the next couple of days. And more energy over Africa, which we'll talk about shortly. And a system in the Eastern Pacific, which could also get going and threaten Mexico over the next couple of days. So taking a look here at the sea surface temperature anomaly, this is updated as of today. Again, this is from cyclonicwx.com. And this is a different data set here, but it's the coral reef, temperature anomalies. And again, different data sets will have different numbers. But generally speaking, across most of the main development region, water temperatures are, in fact, running just above or just near the long-term average. Again, the exception is, of course, off the coast of Africa here. This is mainly, again, north of about 12 degrees north. And this is mainly roughly from 15 all the way up through about 24 north. And the main, again, primary threats here associated with a cooler temperature pattern across here mainly is that there could be a little bit of stability issues. And that could threaten the overall main development region season. Notice how the subtropical Atlantic is warmer out here than it is down here in the main development region. So this area gets a big positive, and this area is not necessarily favorable, but there's a slight catch to this. And what this catch really is, again, we'll jump back here to the 15-day change, and notice how during the 15-day change, we've seen a lot of warming across most of the main development region. We've seen consistent warming, especially north of 12 degrees north. And this has helped to kind of warm the MDR back to slightly above the long-term average. And in the meantime, we've also cooled most of the subtropical Atlantic while warming the main development region. Now, this has been caused because of westerly wind bursts over the MDR, which have subsequently then helped to reduce the trades. You don't get this big push of Saharan air, and we do end up with warming temperatures. And in the ENSO, in the El Nino Southern, or the El Nino Southern Oscillation Index, the Equatorial Pacific here, we really don't see a whole lot of warming. Now, yes, this area is warmer through the dateline here, and it is, of course, warmer near the equator. Now, with that being said, however, these are not sufficient for any El Nino conditions. And in fact, not necessarily. This may be just slightly a warm neutral phase. Now, we have a lot of cooling down here across this area, and because of that, again, a lot of this cool water will eventually kind of offset this area, and we have a big cold blob off here into the Central Pacific, and this really limits the amount of area in the Eastern Pacific that you can get tropical cyclones to develop. It's very confined to this very small area in here. And even when we've seen systems in that region, they tend to struggle. And because of that, there just really isn't a super high amount of storms and quality storms at that are coming out of this region. And for that reason, you don't have a lot of wind shear across here that impacts downstream conditions in the Caribbean and the tropical Atlantic. Now, yeah, we still have wind shear, but that will slowly abate with time. in the warming main development region that should continue for a while will be interesting to note. One other thing real quickly is that we have an Atlantic Nino event, which is basically when the Gulf of Guinea is sufficiently warmer, is really warm. It's basically like an El Nino, mini El Nino, but it's in the southern Atlantic, and it's the Atlantic Nino. And in this case, we have a Atlantic El Nino, which typically can do two things. It can strengthen the West African monsoon, the WAM, or we could also see a pattern in which it takes a lot of the instability away from the main development region because all the warmth is focused down here closer to the equator to about 9 degrees north. And that tends to take away a lot of the upward moving air over the Atlantic and suppresses it further south, along with the intertropical convergence zone. Just one thing kind of going forward, and we'll kind of discuss this in later days, but it's just something to kind of keep in mind that this Atlantic Nino, it's not necessarily a constructive interference, but it could be constructive, but it could also be destructive as an interference in that it takes away that upward moving air that's focused over the MDR and shoves it further south and causes stability and dry air problems. And that's one of the things that is certainly something that we're going to have to watch going forward in time. Now, real quickly here, looking at the actual sea surface temperatures across the Gulf of Mexico, we do notice that this is actually the upwelling path here associated with Claudette. And then Claudette produced a lot of convection, really was never tropical in nature until it actually made landfall here. But notice that there's a big cool blob here, and then where all the other convection was displaced off towards the east, you have a lot of vigorous upwelling here, where water temperatures now, I say vigorous in the comparison, it's, about 28 degrees Celsius instead of 30 Celsius. So, comparatively, but right now, the water temperatures in this region still plenty warm for tropical cyclone activity. And to kind of further that here, this is the upper ocean heat content, valid as of this morning. Again, upper ocean heat content, basically, you want anywhere from the lighter blue colors towards the right of the scale. This is increasing water, upper ocean heat content with depth. Tropical cyclones are very notorious for upwelling cooler water as they move over the ocean. And instead here, if you have higher upper ocean heat content, which is what these warmer colors represent, you only upwell warmer water. And we notice that right now, that most of the Western Atlantic is more than prime in the upper ocean heat content department. And don't let these, lighter shades of blue fool you. You can still get major hurricanes even in these lighter shades of blue here, especially if they are moving a little bit quicker and you have a kind of a near perfect atmospheric environment. You can still get, intense hurricanes that come through that environment. So don't let that really fool you there. But it is important to kind of note that, again, we don't really have a lot right now that is focused in the MDR, especially from 15 degrees north and northward. You don't really have all of that. It's mainly suppressed where the intertropical convergence zone is and where the uninterrupted patterns have been. And the uninterrupted is because this area is less susceptible to trade surges, where more so this area is getting all the trade surge and dust that's blowing out here. And again, this does have some impacts because if you have a suppressed intertropical convergence zone where it's sitting, let's just say about 10 north or whatever, you get these tropical waves that come off. They're a little bit more vigorous through here, and they find themselves in a better environment before they start to turn northward and in through the Caribbean. So it's just something to kind of keep in mind that you could have, one of those lowrider events where you get these storms to kind of form at very low latitudes, almost like Matthew did back in 2016. But even out here across the Gulf here and the Caribbean, water temperatures and upper ocean heat content more than sufficient here. So not really much of any problem there. A tropical cyclone would have no thermodynamic environment or no problem in that sort of thermodynamic environment. Now, looking forward in time here, this is something that we're going to have to start paying attention to closer and closer as the weeks and months kind of come by. This is the European 200 millibar. This is the European ensemble 200 millibar velocity potential anomalies. And this is, again, 200 millibars is roughly about 35 to 40,000 feet. So up at the cruising altitude of airliners, basically. And for what it's worth, just to very simplify this here, again, this is starting out at the 21st of June, which is yesterday. And as you go down, you're increasing time. And then the last time frame here is August 6th. And again, this kind of roughly correlates to this part of the world down here in the map. These browns here and reds, this is sinking air, and conversely, the blues and greens, this is rising air. Now, where's our rising and sinking air at the moment? Well, again, just kind of take a look at it. We have an active phase here that is passing over into the Caribbean and over Africa. And again, this kind of roughly correlates to that area. And then we'll be suppressed for a little bit. Again, we stay kind of mostly quiet for parts of July. Now, just because, and I want to make this very important, just because that we have suppressed air, we don't have a lot of this, dark blue in July, doesn't mean that you won't get storms to form. It just means that there may not be as many, or that the pattern is going to be generally less favorable, and it will take more time for systems to really generate. So that's kind of one thing. Now, after that point, though, we kind of set up with, again, another very active phase that comes out of Africa. This will pass over the Indian Ocean and the West Pacific, eventually kind of into the Eastern Pacific, dies out through here, but then we get a regeneration period into August. And late July into August, we kind of get the standing wave that sets up over Africa and the Indian Ocean. And this is when activity should start to really ramp up towards the climatological peak of the upcoming hurricane season. And again, with this standing wave being here, this is certainly something that, again, has my attention, that typically increases rising air, favors these long African easterly waves, these, tropical waves that, roll off of Africa, and then they end up, developing, somewhere in the MDR or the Caribbean, just like we saw last year. Now, what's going on right now? Well, taking a look here, again, the tropics are fairly quiet in the Atlantic basin. We have this one tropical wave that will be approaching Barbados and the Lesser Antilles over the next few days. Not really expecting any significant development out of this, for the main factor, the reason that, again, right now just is not the time. It's still late June, and maybe once this gets into the Caribbean here, we'll have to watch. But again, not really anything that is substantial at the moment. The pattern seems to favor that we may get something to form, but again, it's just way too early. Regardless, this will bring impacts to the islands here in the form of gusty winds and heavy rainfall. Potential for flooding and mudslides is certainly possible there, because, again, tropical waves, their energy, and just because it's not a hurricane or a tropical storm coming through, it can still provide impacts as much as a, strong tropical storm. So just important to kind of keep that in mind. And conversely, in the Eastern Pacific Basin, we have a system here with an 80% chance of development. And again, this is going to threaten parts of Mexico over the next couple of days. Again, mainly, this will stay well to the south here initially of the Baja Peninsula and Cabo San Lucas, but this will be a threat for parts of Mexico down here. I'm not sure exactly where this is in relative terms, but this will be of some impact. So if you have family and friends that are down in that region, call them, text them, let them know that there could be something that will be potent that will be coming that way here. And if we look here at the Eastern Pacific real quick, we'll touch on the Atlantic side here in a moment. But the Eastern Pacific system, again, this is our system back down in here. We can see that it's, again, nothing really consolidated at the moment, and it's going to take some time. This will eventually kind of move out like that and then maybe turn back towards Mexico over the next couple of days as we get a pattern that is more conducive to these storms that end up kind of recurving back over inland. And this is something that, again, some of the modeling, such as the GFS and some of the other model runs, have kind of indicated, or it is possible that we get kind of this northern lobe of activity to generate and move kind of close like that before maybe kind of skirting away. Now, again, it's a little too early to determine what, if any, impacts may occur, but this will certainly have impacts in the form of heavy rainfall, mudslides and flooding, and some gusty winds over the next couple of days. And in the Atlantic Basin, This is our tropical wave that we've been monitoring over really since about yesterday. And again, this wave is not really well defined. We can see that again, this is kind of a strung out area of vorticity that is kind of in across this area. Again, this is still embedded within the larger monsoonal flow. And here's the Lesser Antilles over here, and this is Barbados. And again, so impacts will begin as early as today. Again, the impacts are going to be no more than a normal tropical wave, maybe this time just a little bit more convective activity, but nothing out of the unordinary in terms of tropical wave impacts. What this does show me, though, is that there is some energy that will be moving into the Caribbean. And this overall moisture environment, this overall moist plume, will be traversing out into parts, really, of the Western Atlantic and maybe find itself somewhere in the Western Caribbean over the next few days. Now, again, is this going to generate? We'll talk about that here in a moment. But looking at the 850 millibar vorticity, this is the spin in the atmosphere about 5,000 feet off the ground. And for context, these reds and whites, that's your higher cyclonic spin at your 5,000 foot level. And just for kind of good sake here, what a tropical cyclone should look like is the remnant circulation here of Claudette. Not really, so far it's not attached to anything, but this is the cold front that's coming down here. Now, even though this is post-tropical, it still has a vigorous closed circulation. It's just now post-tropical and getting influenced by this front and in cooler waters. But the circulation is still around. It's still very vigorous. And that's what we want a tropical cyclone to look like, okay? Now, the best comparison to that we have in the deep tropics is this right here, which will be our system in the Eastern Pacific. And it's still kind of just loosely attached to this kind of intertropical convergence zone. Now, this is our other tropical wave right now that is, nearing the Lesser Antilles. And again, even this doesn't have a well-defined signature. It's very strung out with vorticity stretching into South America here. So I'm not really enthused about development chances with this at all. But this energy will be moving into the Atlantic over the next few days. And we have another tropical wave here just to the southeast of the Cabo Verde Islands, which will be something to monitor a little bit over the next few days. So real quickly, let's look here at the Eastern Pacific system since we've about to touch on that today. And again, what we notice is that this is a very broad and diffuse system. We notice that we don't really have much right now that's really consolidated. We have a broad trough of low pressure that is kind of a trough that's digging in right now out across parts like California. And that will kind of stay there before lifting northward. And this is the 500 millibar flow. So this is really at about 18,400 feet in the atmosphere. And what we'll notice is that our system tries to consolidate here within 78 hours from now. This is by 2 p.m. on Friday. We notice that we have a trough here. And otherwise than that, we just kind of have this broad flow around like that. Now, eventually our system, as we start to end up getting a ridge of high pressure that ends up developing out here, we start to get flow that is more suggestive of kind of a northwest or kind of a northward flow here. And this is what is kind of tugging our system around. But we also notice that we have another system that is in relatively close proximity, within about 700 miles of it, close, but within about 700 miles. Now, this may also cause a little bit of influence to try to rotate the storm kind of up like that. And we kind of notice that this system isn't really doing much. It's just kind of spinning out there and stuff like that. But eventually, this kind of sets up a larger flow. We get this kind of larger cyclonic flow, almost similar to a Central American gyre, that kind of forces this inland here. And because of that, there is a real concern for parts of Mexico here that we could be dealing with the system to impact land. This is the operational GFS. The GFS ensembles, again, suggest that we do end up getting a storm that forms, and a lot of the members get it very dangerously close to land by Sunday morning. This is 2 a.m. Sunday morning, and all of these members in here, there's a lot of clustering and focus on the northern end of that. But there's also several, a handful of members that, are clustered on the south side. So we're looking at a spread, really, of about 200, close to 300 miles of spread. So we could have a storm that is very well offshore as a hurricane, or we could have a storm that is very well near land as a tropical storm or hurricane as well. It's important to kind of understand that. 200 millibar winds, let's go back to the GFS here. Again, we'll look here at the 200 millibar wind. This is up at about the cruising level of airliners again. We notice that we have a broad anticyclonic flow that ends up developing. Again, this kind of in part because we have a ridge over here, and we get expanded outflow potential on the northern side of that. And on the southern side, there's really no shear to compete with. So you end up having a fairly strong pocket here of upper level anticyclone. And eventually, though, what ends up happening is outflow starts to get restricted. We have an upper level low that will be backing from the Florida Peninsula and backing into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's a very sharp area, very sharp cutoff low here. But you can kind of see this upper level low here. And this is kind of retrograding southwest. And you can tell that there's kind of two opposing flows here. You've got flow coming out of the northwest here, but you have flow coming generally out of the west blowing to the east. And because of that, we can start to see that once this upper level low starts to impact the shear, it starts to reduce the outflow on the northern side. And the storm doesn't really intensify much, and actually now is getting forced more inland because of the influences here of this ridge and upper level low sitting over the Gulf of Mexico. So this is one of the reasons why there could be the potential for a storm that impacts Mexico. And on the more recent model runs, again, on the model run here, this is from 0Z June 22nd. So this is actually the 0Z run from last night. And we noticed that, again, the upper level low was a little bit more situated like this. And you can see that very sharp gradient, a little bit of a stronger storm still getting tugged into Mexico. The bottom line here, the bottom line is that there will be some potential that we could see a tropical cyclone to impact Mexico over the next couple of days. The European model, again, much of the same. It develops a system and skirts it near coastal Mexico. This time it is a little bit closer here to the Baja, and eventually this passes as a remnant circulation near the Baja Peninsula and the Cabo San Lucas resort areas. So there's always a threat there, but we'll be kind of monitoring everything and keeping you up to date with that. In the Atlantic side of everything, today is a long video discussion, but on the Atlantic side of everything, this is the 850 millibar vorticity, again, spinning the atmosphere about 5,000 feet off the ground. And in the Atlantic side of everything right now, we have a pretty strong Azores high. This is the Azores Islands, and that's the Canary Islands. This is the remnant circulation associated with Claudette here, and again, most of the flow keeping everything pretty suppressed down here with the intertropical convergence zone. Again, our one little system tries to spin up, but it just gets tugged too far northward. And because of that, there's a lot of strong shear that is being imparted across this area. And just it's very hostile this time of year, as one would expect. But we'll notice that, again, the GFS does have this remnant vorticity here. This is by hour 210. Does have the remnant vorticity entering the Gulf of Mexico. And this trend has been very concise in the GFS runs over the last couple of days. And again, it's, going to flip and flop. We've seen models that, go to suggest, major hurricane, and models that drop it. Don't get so caught up in that and refrain from really posting anything about, the GFS showing a major hurricane, this, that, whatever. It's simply not going to happen, at least in the 5-day period. And more than a fact, this is probably just a convective feedback problem, which is a well-known bias of the GFS. My point in all of this, though, is that an upcoming window of favorability is possible in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So on the flip side of everything, there is a pattern switch that is upcoming, but it's going to be slow to happen, and it'll be beyond 5 days from now, so I'm not even really worried about that. However, I am interested in a tropical wave that will be coming off of Africa. And we see this in the GFS that, again, this tropical wave starts to spin up here by hour 96 and does develop just a little background cyclonic vorticity bit. But look here at the relative humidity. Again, we have a fairly moist pocket in the atmosphere, and looking at an average sounding for the area, what we'll end up kind of noticing here is that shear is relatively light. We have mostly uniform shear that is mainly out of the east. And because of that, we don't really have a lot of shear, but notice that we have a lot of capping in the atmosphere. And someone asked a question about that yesterday, or not yesterday, but the day before. Capping is basically, if we kind of zoom in here, notice where the red temperature line here crosses over the theoretical parcel temperature here. And when you have that, you have a capping, you have a very capped environment where thunderstorms cannot develop. And that's basically what the capping inversion is. And we often associate that with severe weather setups. But in this case, it's also useful for predicting thunderstorms and whether or not a storm may or may not develop in that region. So it's very important to understand that something may or may not develop, but the capping inversion is a big problem there, and one of the things that may inhibit thunderstorm activity over the next couple of days. Also, for what it's worth here, the GFS ensembles, though, do end up kind of developing a system. And we kind of notice that here, that the GFS ensembles, although they are not as impressive as previous runs, we do notice that there is some members here that suggest something. The European model, however, while its operational run doesn't necessarily develop a system. This is 96, and this is then as hour 120, hour 144, so on and so forth. This tropical wave energy eventually, according to the Euro, makes its way into the Caribbean, and from there, again, whatever happens, happens. But the European ensembles on the 6E run, over half of the members are generating a storm by day 5, which is here. Over half of the members have a storm in this area by day 5, some stronger than others. This is important because this has a lot of potential impacts going forward. And again, the Euro here was suggesting maybe somewhat of a longer track system coming out of the main development region and into the central Atlantic over the next couple of days. So this is something to watch, but nothing to worry about, nothing to get hype over, nothing is set in stone, but the pattern seems to suggest that a window of favorability might be upcoming. All right? So, with that being said, it's never too early to get your hurricane preparedness plans ready. It is hurricane season. We should be monitoring this area anyway. All right? So, with that being said, I hope you all have a great rest of your afternoon and evening. Of course, I am Michael O'Malley. I'll talk to you guys again some more tomorrow.